not only deal with Ukrainian history and historiography, but you also deal with Polish and Russian history, and your work is about, let's say, the very problematic aspects of the relations between these three countries, and your work specifically tackles the most difficult issues between these three countries. And I will only I will actually show a couple of articles that recently appeared in a language that we all speak. I think your research is very actual and very topical, and Andrii's research, I think, is relevant for all those that try to understand, first of all, I mean, from the perspective of what is actual nowadays, the war in the east of Ukraine, and also about how Ukrainian intellectual elites position themselves towards this conflict. It is also about the Volhynia massacre, historical events, let's say, get rediscovered by politicians and turned into the stuff for politics. I will also like to add a couple of more words that I think, so they are from one of your books, and I think they're quite programmatic about what Andrii does, and I think these are words from which we all can learn. In your book, you start with a quote from George Orwell about arts and about no book being free of political bias. And you also quote Orwell saying that each book or any art, you paraphrase this, you say any historiography that makes the promise of freeing itself from politics does exactly that, politics. And you plead for, let's say, for a scholarship that contributes to the openness, that contributes to openness, and let me now quote you, openness towards topics that hurt, an openness that makes us understand how important a culture of self-criticism is and of responsible historical contextualization. So, self-criticism and historical contextualization. Beautiful words, and I think these are inspirational for many of us. Thanks for coming, Andrii, and you have the floor.
Okay, good evening. Good evening. I'm very grateful for this invitation. I should probably tell you that when Katarina Bloom wrote me and asked about the possibility to talk about the topic more or less like that, I was first like thinking whether I should do it, as Mihai said, touching something that is actually not a precise field of my research. But then I decided that, like, actually, why not? It's a kind of like attempt to do it differently. And please believe me, it was not at all discussed between me and Mihai, but I will start for some strange written from George Orwell today as well. So as we know, he called his dystopian novel about the totalitarian system, that comes after capitalism, by the year 1984. And actually there is a kind of a, let's say, discussion or controversy why Orwell decided to call it like that and not, let's say, choose another date. And one of the interpretations said that maybe it was just a kind of like game for him because he finished the text in 1948. So like just switching the numbers, making it 84. Anyway, this date, 1984, for some strange reason, proved to be, I would say, pretty symbolic, or at least relevant, for the topic of our today conversation, and most of all because of this book. Maybe some of you read it already. So Andrei Amalrik's books, which is called Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984? Actually, what's interesting, in Amalrik's argument, there is no direct, at least no direct, let's say, quote or reference to Orwell at all. So it's a very different story. But what's amazing that this person, so Russian essayist, dissident, who finished this text in 1969 in Moscow, 1969 in Moscow, we could say, okay, predicted not just the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also what he called simultaneous dissolution of the socialist camp and the reunification of Germany in 1969. So according to him, okay, it's difficult to predict as we know. According to him, it would be most of all an effect of a war between Soviet Union and China. So that never happened, as we know. But the very year selected by Amalrik to be presented as a crucial date is still interesting, like 1984. And of course, it's said that he himself had no chance to see how close actually his prognosis was to what happened, because he died in car accident in 1980 in Spain. Yeah, so he spent some time in Soviet prison, and then he was allowed to go abroad, and he died in car accident in Spain. And you see, of course, nowadays, it's a very different situation, very different context. And nowadays, when we think about the Soviet Union or many, many other cases, let's say ex-Yugoslavia, whatsoever, we could very much use a kind of retrospective knowledge. Yeah, or let's say to interpret the events, the situation, knowing more or less the way they ended up. And if you, let's say, look back at the Russian Empire, yeah, beginning of the 20th century, there was also kind of a, let's say, discussion, where could we start the beginning of the end of the Russian Empire? And one would say the Japanese War, this terrible war for Russia, and then the revolution of 1905 that followed the war and was also a big disaster. In one book I found another interesting idea that the anti-Jewish Kishinev pogrom of 1903 could be seen as this crucial turning point, because it showed with all, let's say, with all clarity, all the problems of the Russian government, which was very much also involved in the process of, you know, like engaging in the in provoking anti-Jewish violence. Anyway, if you ask, let's say, do it like that. I've asked myself a couple of days ago, how could we trace back, or where could we trace back the end of the Soviet Union? And we have a lot of possibilities to do that, absolutely. For instance, one could say that it could be traced back to December 1979, when the Soviet troops entered Afghanistan. And the Afghan war began, and it lasted for almost 10 years. One would say, and there is kind of argument about it, 1980, so the year when Amalrik died, and the year when Polish Solidarity, this incredibly massive workers and intelligentsia movement, appeared to be a very serious threat for the entire so-called communist system, and not just Poland, not just Polish Republic at the time. Or, of course, we could speak about April 1986, Chernobyl, yeah, what happened quite near the capital city of Soviet Ukraine, Kiev. And there are also books written more or less like that, Chernobyl as a sign of the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. But we may also say, if it actually, I'll come to this event maybe later as well, December 1986, when in Kazakhstan, in the capital city of Soviet Kazakhstan, there was an unprecedented youth movement against the appointment of the Russian guy to be the head of the Kazakh Communist Party. And like the point was like that, we don't want someone who has never worked in Kazakhstan to become leader of our republic. Please choose a Kazakh guy who is from this place. And it happened in the Soviet Union in 1986, so long before all the events we know later. Or we may also use the date, let's say August 1987, when in Riga, Tallinn, and Vilnius, so in 3 capitals of the Baltic Republic, there was the first wave of huge mass demonstrations related to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so Hitler-Stalin Pact, and this idea that actually Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia lost their independence because of the Soviet aggression and the beginning of the Second World War. And it's really interesting because also if you talk, like I try to do oral history, and I've tried to do it a little bit for my book about Dnipropetrovsk, which also, of course, has to do with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, then quite often you could find actually the point that like the real trouble for people, you know, like living their lives, was actually the incredible development of deficit and all kinds of economic troubles in late 80s. I even probably have some pictures here. So like troubles to, it was becoming gradually difficult to buy everything, including bread. And it was also pretty difficult to spend your money, and then a little bit later, almost all the money kept in the Soviet bank just disappeared. It was one day when all that you like collected for the life, like my parents did, it was just nothing. And like, I want to think seriously about such experience, and what does it mean for a lot of us. But of course, in any case, now like coming back to 1984, in any case, whether it would be Chernobyl or stories of the Baltics or Kazakhstan and so on, of course there is a crucial date, crucial event, a crucial person to be mentioned here, and it's of course Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who actually started so-called perestroika in not 84, 85, but it's very close to what Amarik predicted in his strange book. And it's also interesting, of course, that this very word perestroika became international, like samovar, pogrom, and some other famous Russian words. Even though you have also, of course, like variation of it in Ukrainian, in Lithuanian, and so on, but nobody uses them usually. It's just perestroika. Okay, and I decided to reread this book of him. A very interesting book. It's called Perestroika and New Thinking, published in 1987. It's actually amazing that he wrote this book in 1987 for the American publisher. It was published, of course, in the Soviet Union as well. So you have like the Soviet and the American version of it, but still. And this book is a kind of, say, official narrative of what perestroika was at least supposed to be about. And reading this book today, like keeping in mind, knowing what happened later, it's really something, I would say, it's an incredible experience. So first of all, Gorbachev, or someone who helped him to write this stuff, very much acknowledged the fact of the crisis of the Soviet economy, Soviet political system, which was already a big, let's say, a big deal and a big change if compared to the official Soviet narrative before. And then he said that the solution for this problem, complex problem, should be, now attention, peaceful and democratic revolution. So revolution, this word is used in a positive context in this sense, based on the involvement of masses into the process of decision-making and governing the country. So in other words, it was said more or less like that. We, the Communist Party, the Soviet government, we should involve masses as much as possible into solving of the problems of the state. And then, like looking at different, let's say, dimensions or different angles of the societal life, it's very interesting. In terms of economy, it was mostly about self-financing, joint ventures with the Western, let's say, enterprises, fabrics. But it was also about planning from below. So you see, it was not like this idea that we should stop the very idea of socialist planning, which was usually done in Moscow, in centrally based institution, and then sent to every local enterprise, saying like, you need to produce this and that amount of something, I don't know, bread or pipes or whatsoever. But it was the idea that now we should start planning from below, not from above, but from below. Okay, if we look at, let's say, political level, it was, I would say, maybe even more revolutionary in a sense, because it proposed this, again, very famous notion of glasnost or openness, saying that it could be like interpreted as an official encouragement for public discussion of a range of topics. Of course, the range of topics was limited, especially at first, but then gradually it became wider, wider, and wider, and wider, including, of course, the publication of previously forbidden texts, like Vasily Grossman, or Solzhenitsyn, or Nabokov, or also Ukrainian or Lithuanian or Georgian writers in particular republics, no less important. And then in May, June 1989, something extremely important happened. I would say it's probably one of the most important things, again, thinking back. And we could describe this thing as a kind of almost free or semi-free elections. So people for the first time since early 1918, were allowed to choose between several candidates elected to the councils, to the Soviet Council and to the councils of the Soviet republics on all possible levels. And now attention again. So you were allowed to choose between several candidates, but it was still not a multi-party system. So he or she could be a non-communist party member, at least theoretically, but there was no way to say, okay, now we have like the second party, the third party, and so on. So you could also feel like this idea that there should be some limits, but nobody really knew where to put them and how to define them. Actually, one aspect of original perestroika is often, let's say, absent, especially in the Western perception, Western in this sense. It's this Gorbachev's anti-alcoholic campaign. So his campaign against, drinking alcohol, promotion of non-alcoholic wedding ceremonies and stuff like that. As you could imagine, it's one of the biggest failures. Was one of the biggest failures of the entire enterprise, but still, you see, it was this idea that we should improve the, let's say, the quality of our society. Like we should somewhere impose this ban on alcohol in order to have more, thinking and positively oriented people, which is an interesting idea. Of course, when this set of points and arguments was presented, we should of course remember that before Gorbachev there were three pretty old general secretaries, so Chernenko, and before him Andropov, and then Brezhnev, who died just several years before. It was like a young person symbolizing this new trend. Actually, his wife was also symbolizing a lot. It's a separate topic. Maybe we could come to this later if you wish. But anyway, the reactions to the proposals were already different in a time when it all happened. And just to illustrate it, I'll show you this strange book, which is not very famous. It's a book written by Alexander Zinoviev, a Russian emigre writer. I would say very good writer, brilliant writer, who lived in Munich at the time. And for instance, he tried to analyze like what all this perestroika is about. So for Zinoviev, it was an unrealistic, actually this quote could be found in a different formula in very recent publications about this story. Like unrealistic idea of combining communist and Western society values and attitudes. And he wrote that Gorbachev reforms are actually artificial arrangements aimed at bringing to life phenomena which are alien to the very nature of communist society. In other words, if you start doing things like joint ventures or semi-free elections, you will inevitably destroy the entire system. And that's, of course, a good question whether it is what actually happened or maybe some other factors played the important role. But anyway, it seems to be like more or less a kind of a consensus point. Now I'm quoting from one book published recently, that by introducing first one element of change and then another, Gorbachev progressively eroded the very system through which he had risen. And here you have a kind of a paradox, because on the one hand, the entire idea was about using state, using communist party, using institutions of power to impose something on society. But on the other hand, by destroying institutions, KGB and power, the possibilities of such impact becoming like smaller and smaller. It's a kind of like paradox inherited by the very way of presenting the story. So by relinquishing the party's monopoly of power and initiative, Gorbachev actually reduced his own influence as well. And his unintended success in weakening the administrative and repressive apparatus on which the Soviet system depended caused a great problem for him as a politician in a couple of years. So very soon, it's also interesting. Maybe the most amazing part of this book, at least for me, is of course the part of the international politics and foreign relations. Because if you read it now, also having in mind what's going on, like literally, like let's say in last months, it's truly unbelievable. Because in this part of international politics was built on ideas of peace, impermissibility of the nuclear war, disarmament, and even gradual liquidation of nuclear weapons until the end of the 20th century. That was presented as the primarily goal behind this. Now, of course, we can speculate whether it was just a kind of recognition of the fact that Soviet militarized economy was getting weaker and weaker if compared to the first of all, US economy, or whether it was a kind of a clever strategy how to redefine the very notion of control. Because again, already in 1985, and in this book for the second time, Soviet leadership openly said that we would like to give our socialist countries in Eastern Europe, Soцлагерь, complete independence. In other words, like truly free elections, possibility to decide what to do, and so on. So really it happened before all the, let's say, terrible events inside the Soviet Union. And also another narrative which was very strong in this book as well was the narrative of common European civilization. And this attempt to describe the Soviet Union as an integral part of the European culture from Lisbon to Vladivostok, with all the implications and ideas what it could mean for the future. We'll come back maybe briefly to this issue, what actually happened in international relations, but the first, like, very serious impact could be seen in what happened in internal situation inside the Soviet Union, because this very attempt to start glasnost, to start publishing forbidden books, had enormous effect, and quite soon, already in late 80s, for instance, the Crimean Tatars were allowed for the first time to come back from Uzbekistan to Crimea. So the last people, so entire nation deported by Stalin in '44 were allowed to go back. Then, for instance, in Western Ukraine, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was allowed to be re-established. It was, let's say, officially called united with the Russian Church, but unofficially, of course, just destroyed in 1946, and then it came back. So we have these all possible appearances of new national, religious, ethnic, whatsoever institutions and groups that actually caused a very serious discussion what this national problem or nationality problem at all inside the Soviet Union actually mean. Because as we know, especially in late 80s, there was a widespread belief, not just in the USSR, also very much in the West, that the nationality question is definitely, you know, solved in the Soviet state. And if you speak Soviet, it means Russian. If it's Soviet Union, it's Russia, and like that. And actually, I just want to remind you that one of the first books ever written in Western languages about this very difficult issue of, let's say, national question in the Soviet Union appeared in German. It was done by Gerhard Simon, a good colleague of mine in Köln. And please keep attention, it was done in 1986, so long before all the like real ethnic conflicts in the post-Soviet space. And when it appeared, it was like saying like that, a lot of comments say that like he's writing on non-existent problem because there is like nothing to talk about, which was not true. So it is always interesting to keep in mind that there are some examples of scholarship that really, you know, like have not just follow the fashionable traces, but trying to propose something unusual. Okay, now thinking about this complexity of nationality issue, we should maybe briefly look at this map, just to remind you very briefly how the Soviet Union looked like in the late 80s, early 90s. So it was, I would say, kind of like semi-federation, so like officially federative state with 15 republics, again officially with equal rights, including the right to quit the federation. But actually it's not enough to say that we have like 15 equal brothers and sisters in the Union. Because this is the biggest republic, the Russian Soviet Socialist Federal Republic, was actually the most, let's say, unusual and strange one. Because in this case, we have a semi-federation inside a semi-federation. So it was like the only republic which actually could be hardly described just as kind of a national republic, in a way that, you know, Tajikistan, Moldova, or Estonia could still be described. And on the one hand, there was this idea all the time that Soviet Union means Russia, and Russians are, you know, the most important people and nations of the state. On the other hand, for instance, we should keep in mind that there were 14, for instance, academies of sciences, Ukrainian, Kazakh, whatsoever, and no Russian academy, but Soviet Academy of Sciences in Moscow and Leningrad. In other way, there were also like kind of Russian nationalism saying that Russia is somewhere like lost in this strange federative unit. And all those issues, of course, came back very soon and caused a lot of problem to the entire situation. In 1981, late Brezhnev spoke about the formation of the Soviet people. A Soviet people in a sense of a new social and national entity. At the same time, he never said that like we should forget about nationalities. Nationalities will still exist, but we have a kind of like supranational or Soviet or self-identity or so on. 1981. In 1986, as I said before, first in Kazakhstan, there was this peaceful but still very impressive demonstration against the appointment of the person with the Russian family name to be the head of the Kazakhstan Communist Party. And the very idea that you could oppose and base this opposition on the argument of ethnic origin and place of work was a kind of real challenge for the entire system. And as you could imagine, hopefully, the protesters succeeded. So the guy who was supposed to become the head of the Soviet Kazakhstan, he was sent back, and a brilliant political career of Nursultan Nazarbayev very much started actually at that moment. But then something much more terrible happened in February 1988. February 1988, 88. It's a story of an anti-Armenian pogrom in the city of Sumgait in Azerbaijan, where according to official statistics in 1988, 32 people died. They were killed, tortured and killed. According to, let's say, the oral history sources and recent scholarship, it seems that hundreds of people were killed. So it was a real massacre. And the very fact that you have ethnic pogrom in the Soviet state, where, as Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev said, the old Soviet people are emerging. It was, of course, like a big shock. And then there were another pogroms also in Tajikistan in 1990. People died and so on. And of course, it showed very much that Gerhard Zimmermann was right, actually. There is a nationality problem in the Soviet Union. And what's even more interesting, like now let's imagine if you have a state which is at least formally federal, and you have a serious political economic crisis within it. Of course, the interesting question is how the borders of the possible, let's say, separatist movements will be defined. In this case, it was, we could say, like, primitively speaking, much easier, because all the republics already had semi-official, but still institutes of their own government, academies of sciences, newspapers, whatsoever. And long before the Soviet Union formally and legally ceased to exist, we have this incredible, let's say, festival of the declarations of state sovereignty adopted by the Supreme Councils of the Soviet Republics. So again, adopted by the officially elected councils of the Soviet Republics. You have 15 republics and all the dates here. I don't know, hopefully you could more or less read it. The point is that the declarations were adopted in different times. So the first one in Estonia, you see, like autumn 1988. The last one in Kyrgyzstan in December 1990. What's even more amazing, if you compare the texts of the declarations, they're very different. They're really different. We have unfortunately no time to go into details, but I just like to give you the feeling what we're talking about. In one case, first in Lithuania, there was a point that Lithuania was a victim of Soviet occupation according to Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and that is why there is no legal basis for its presence in the Soviet Union. In Georgian declaration, there was a point that Georgia was occupied by the Bolshevik troops in 1921, and since that, it is like illegally there. But still, despite this claim, almost always you have like in the next point saying that we are waiting for the new discussion about the future of the federation or confederation. So be careful. In this case, paradoxically maybe, state sovereignty, государственный суверенитет, does not mean independence. So there are two different things. Usually, at least in the logic of the people who adopted the documents, it meant first and foremost economic independence. So let's say the possibility of the particular republic to decide about its economic life and not to wait for instructions from Moscow. In case of Belarus, for instance, in case of Belarus, there were like claim that Belarus wanted compensation from the USSR for Chernobyl disaster, and that it wanted to be nuclear-free territory. Also interesting. So like trying to presume this argument about, yeah, because Chernobyl was very much about nuclear atomcraft. And what about Russia? It's very interesting, because if you look here, like where is the Russian Federation? Russia is very much on the top of the list. So it's 12th June 1990, before Ukraine, before Moldova, before Armenia, before Tajikistan, so before many places. And what about Russia? In case of Russia, again, like the document is most of all about Russia's ownership of its natural resources. And the point behind is very interesting, because the point behind is more or less like that actually Russia, as a part of the Soviet Union, produces much more than a lot of other republics, but receives back economically much less. And in other words, in order to, let's say, free ourselves from the misuse of our resources, we actually need this state sovereignty. And at the same time, it claimed that Russia's future as a democratic state ruled by law lies in the reformed Soviet Union. And that was actually a typical phrase almost always present in such declarations. Now, what's very important here? Very important question here, and was also crucial for the future of the Soviet Union and post-Soviet states, was that, more or less like that, who have a right for state sovereignty? Because you see, in this case, it was obvious that all the republics mentioned in the Soviet constitution have right for the state sovereignty. But what about autonomous republics within the Russian Republic, for instance? Or what about some particular regions, maybe even just regions, who for some reason would say, okay, we also want, you know, to control our natural resources, or to have sovereignty, to negotiate and whatsoever. And that's actually what happened. And that happened, and how it happened could hopefully like explain us what was this entire story about. Two extreme cases, but very, let's say, interesting, are, in my view at least, are of course Chechnya and Crimea. So what happened in Chechnya, briefly? First of all, there was no Chechnya in the Soviet Russian Republic. There was Checheno-Ingusskaya Автономная Республика, so Checheno-Ingushetia. And this republic adopted its own declaration of state sovereignty on 27th November 1990. And it's actually the only declaration I've seen where there is no mention about Soviet Union or Soviet Russia. So they just said, we have state sovereignty in Checheno-Ingushetia, and we will decide about economic and whatsoever issues. But it was just the beginning of the story. Because in June 1991, so June 1991, it is before Putsch, it is before all these stories. It was still Soviet Union very much. In June 1991, in Chechnya, we have a proclamation of Chechen National Republic. In other words, like idea that, okay, we don't need this Ingushetia part anymore. It's their story, but we have Chechen Republic there. And then in September 1999, so that's right after the putsch in Moscow, in September 1999, General Dudayev returned actually from Tartu, from Estonia, returned to Grozny and made a kind of a putsch, a local putsch in Grozny, in Chechnya, and proclaimed state independence. And already in November 1991, President of Russia, Yeltsin, proclaimed state of emergency in Chechnya. In other words, you see, what was okay, allowed for the Soviet republics was not at all allowed for the autonomous republic within the Russian Federation. Another story, no less interesting, maybe less, because as we know, the consequence we know, 2 wars, hundreds of thousands of people killed and so on. Another story, very interesting, is the story of Crimea, because in Crimea, it is not always mentioned, but in Crimea, we have the first referendum on the post-Soviet space, the very first referendum on the post-Soviet space, a referendum initiated by the Moscow government, by Gorbachev and people around him. And it was a referendum, now very careful, it's very interesting, because Crimea in let's say late 80s, early 90s. It was part of the Soviet Ukraine after the decision of the Supreme Council made in 1954 to give, let's say, Crimea from the Russian Republic to Ukrainian Republic. And what happened in January 1991? January 1991. In January 1991, in Crimean Oblast, so Crimean region, there was a referendum held with the question, do you support the restoration of the Crimean Autonomous Republic, and now attention, as a subject of the Soviet Union? So, not as an autonomous republic within Ukraine. It was formulated like that, autonomous republic as a subject of the Soviet Union. So in other words, it wasn't like, I was saying, like brilliant idea how to play with this issue of sovereignty, territoriality, ethnicity, in this case potentially against Ukraine. And what happened then? Referendum was done. The majority of people who voted, of course, supported the questions. It's typical for referendums on post-Soviet space. Usually, if you need a kind of an answer, you get it. It's the story of Ukraine, Russia, and yeah, Belarus, absolutely. We could discuss it later if you wish. But what happened later? Literally in a couple of weeks, in February 1991, Supreme Council of the Soviet Ukrainian Republic said that we agree to give Crimea status of autonomous republic within Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So in other words, it was not actually exactly what they were asked to vote for, because they were asked to vote for being subject to the Soviet Union, and they became the subject of the Soviet Ukraine. And as you could imagine, it was of course very much used all the time since that in all the debates about the peninsula, and it was very much made by the same Mr. Gorbachev who agreed, for instance, that the united Germany should enter NATO and stuff like that. Okay, now maybe the second important question here is about the peaceful nature of it, because quite often you have this narrative that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was incredibly peaceful if compared to, again, ex-Yugoslavia or the Russian Empire or even the Ottoman Empire in the 20th century, of course. But still, we should keep in mind that this peaceful character was not entirely peaceful and not always peaceful. And there are some extreme examples just to remind it about you. Again, you see here, it's April 1989. In April 1989, there was demonstrations in Tbilisi, so in Georgia again, and they were brutally suppressed by the military. And here are the pictures of the victims. And actually, hopefully you could see that the majority of victims, in this case in Tbilisi, they were women. Almost all of the victims were women, because what happened, they were just protesting near the administrative building, and then like the troops came and tried to, to press them out, and it was like really like a kind of a pressure for crowds of people, and yeah, in this case, mostly women did not survive it. So officially, I'll tell you how many. 20 people were killed in Tbilisi, according to official data. And then we have also this story in Vilnius and Riga in January 1991, where also people were killed, also like, let's say, in a conflict between demonstrators and the military. That's a burial ceremony in Vilnius, and in Vilnius we have 14 people killed, in Riga 4. So of course it's incomparable to the data from Yugoslavia again, but still it shows that in some cases this process of dissolution was not entirely peaceful. But peaceful is just one issue here. There are two another very important issues. First, let's say national sovereignty and nuclear weapons. Very much, because let us not forget that what Gorbachev wrote in this book, going to the nuclear-free world and so on. Soviet nuclear weapons were located not just in Russia, also in Ukraine, also in Belarus, also partly in Kazakhstan. And it's interesting that if you analyze American policy at the moment, so George Bush administration and people around him, you'll see something very interesting, because on the one hand, the US supported from the late 80s the idea of giving independence to the Baltic states, because all of them were never recognized officially by the US and the majority of other Western countries as part of the Soviet Union. It's a kind of like, let's say, present day. No, I'm not making comparison. So it was like this idea that because it's not exactly the same. But they were never officially recognized as part of the Soviet Union, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. But the rest of the republics, according to the dreams of American government, they were supposed to stay very much. And there was famous speech given by President Bush in Kiev, where he went to the crowd of people and said, you should stay in the Soviet Union, you should follow Gorbachev. And it was a kind of a shock, because at the moment Gorbachev was very unpopular, mostly and now I'm coming to my third point here, for economic reasons again. So it's very crucial to keep in mind that this notion of sovereignty was extremely close to the notion of economic growth and economic problems, troubles with bread, and so on. I'll show you a very interesting and typical visual illustration of it. So that's Donbas miners' strike, 1991, and you have a fascinating slogan there, saying that independent Ukraine will bring an end to the poverty of the working people. You see, the strikes, coal miner strikes, in Ukraine and Russia, so in Donbas and Kuzbas, they started in 1989, 1990. 100,000 of people were involved in them. And the main logic behind the strike was more or less like that. In order to make the conditions of work better, we need to get rid of central planning, and we actually need a kind of Republican-based planning. So in Kuzbas, in Russia, people were saying we want President Yeltsin and Russian state decide how should we work. In this case, in Donetsk, Lugansk, Pavlograd, very close to Manitiv city, they were saying that we need Kiev to decide how we should work. And then we get rid of this ineffective Soviet planning system and we live happily. So you see this idea that independence, sovereignty should bring economic prosperity, which is of course very naive, as we know now, but it was not obvious for them at the moment. And keeping in mind this logic, we could probably better understand that maybe it could sound paradoxically, but what happened actually, that in late 80s, early 90s, it was Donbas, so actually present-day area of war. Yeah, it was Donbas who played a crucial role in the Soviet Ukrainian development and anti-Soviet, let's say, sentiments and movements. And it was Soviet Ukrainian, in turn, who played a very much crucial role in the dissolution of the entire Soviet Union. And now just to remind you very briefly the important events. So in March 1991, there was another referendum, but it was not the first one, it was the second one. So the first one was in Crimea in January. They said, very good, we could receive all results we need. So in March 1991, another referendum. The question was to preserve the reformed Federation of Sovereign Republics. So to preserve the Soviet Union, but as a reformed federation of already sovereign republics, because they were all sovereign at the moment. Again, it was March 91. Everybody is sovereign at the moment. So okay, but what happened in this referendum? Of course, the majority of people voted as Gorbachev wanted them to do, but already then you see that there were republics where Republican elites decided not to participate in the referendum, and that's really amazing. So communist officials very much decided not to participate in Gorbachev-initiated referendum. And it happened in, as you could imagine, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, but it's not the entire story. It also happened in Armenia, in Georgia, and in Moldova. So there was no referendum about the future of the Soviet Union in 6 republics of the Soviet Union. It was already kind of a very telling evidence here. So Gorbachev was planning to produce a new union agreement, most of all between Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan as the biggest republics, also geographically, demographically. But then in August 1991, I remember actually paradoxically those days very well also personally, so in August 1991 we have this story of so-called putsch in Moscow, attempt to, let's say, save the Soviet Union by conservative part of the army and the party and so on. And it's actually important to remember that the main argument, in this GKChP narrative was that they are against the confederative union of the Soviet sovereign republics. So they were saying more or less like that. We need the Soviet Union as before. Not this new, sovereignty whatsoever. We need like this normal semi-federal Soviet Union as before. And it failed. It was just like 3 days story. And then already in September 1991, State Council of the Soviet Union officially recognized independence of 3 Baltic states. So it happened before, let's say, before the events in December. It happened already in September that 3 Baltic republics became independent and recognized by Moscow completely in this situation. And then in 1st December 1991, another referendum in Ukraine. So in Crimea, it was the 3rd one, actually. So in Crimea, you have the 3rd referendum per year. And this time it was for the independence of Ukraine. And actually, again, the majority of Crimeans voted for. So interesting. So they supported all the let's say, questions asked, the majority. And then in the 8th of December 1991, it was like legally, officially, there was, moment, probably I have even picture here. Oh, and it's 8th December 1991, meeting in Belarus, in Belovezhskaya Pushcha, of representatives of Soviet Russia, Soviet Ukraine, and Soviet Belarus. They are signing here an agreement to, let's say, replace the USSR by the Commonwealth of Independent States, or SNG. But as we see already from the data, it was just, let's say, like the legal fixation of something that very much happened before. And here it's actually interesting because quite often in the literature you could find this argument that actually it all happened because the main process already happened in the center, in Moscow, because actually it was very much Russia that initiated this move for sovereignty. It was very much Yeltsin, here's Yeltsin, of course, yeah, over there. So Yeltsin's, struggling against Gorbachev and so on. Maybe some historians, like for instance, this guy, Sergei Portnov from Harvard, he's trying to argue that actually Ukrainian communist leadership played a crucial role. A quote, "It was the Ukrainian elites' insistence on the independence and inability of the Russian elites to offer the Ukrainian leadership an attractive integrationist alternative that turned out to be crucial in deciding the fate of the Soviet Union." What's interesting in this quote? First of all, it's interesting that he speaks about elites in both cases. It's not about like masses, minors, whatsoever. It's about communist elites, that's first. Second, it's very interesting, this idea that Russian leadership, let's say Yeltsin in this case, failed to propose a kind of like another definition of an union that caused a lot of trouble here. Of course, an interesting question would be, and should be probably, why Ukrainian elites, for instance, President Kravchuk, former secretary on ideology of the Communist Party of Ukraine, why they insisted on the independence? What was like the interest behind it? And that's actually very much the question to understand what happened afterwards with all those countries. And in order to think about it, of course, we should keep in mind that we have a kind of a political leadership continuity in almost all post-Soviet republics, including, not entirely, but very much, including the Baltic states. So even in the Baltics, you could find numerous examples of people like Brazauskas and others who played a crucial role in very new post-Soviet context. And of course, that's need to be explained, because on the one hand, there is this idea of changing borders, having new states, new flags, new currencies, and whatsoever. On the other hand, it is very much the story of the same people who control political and economic life in the country. And quite often, we may hear that actually this reincarnation of nomenclatura was actually the price to be paid for relatively peaceful transformation. Relatively peaceful, even though we have those stories from Tbilisi and Vilnius and so on. In other words, if we want more revolutionary change, we should be aware that the cost will be blood. We don't know that. It's just a kind of a speculation about this situation. But I think we could agree with the point that the situation that we could analyze in post-Soviet Russia, Ukraine, and majority of other republics, could be described as a kind of a political capitalism. So it was not socialism anymore. None of the republics, none of the ex-socialist states in Eastern Europe decided to build, like this Dubček type socialism with human face. Nobody. So it was capitalism, but it was political capitalism in the sense that the processes of privatization, decision-making, they were very much still controlled by the people who played a crucial role in the Soviet system, in the late Soviet period, and in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And in my view also, it could very much explain what's going on now, like in Ukraine, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, in many, many other cases. In the story of the Baltic republics, of course, we have a new, very important factor, which was the enlargement of the European Union and NATO, but it never happened to other states here, and so that is why all the processes are also going on like that. And in this sense, of course, it could be kind of like question for discussion whether it's correct to describe the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a kind of revolution, if in terms of elites and decision-making control, it was, I wouldn't say very much the same, but still it was very much, let's say, dependent on what happened there. And it was not, in case of Ukraine, it's very good here. It was not, like former dissidents who formed the government, who decided what to do now. It was most of all former party, KGB and Komsomol people. And it would be true even for the present day leadership of Ukraine. So after 25 years, and the same is very much true with other stories here. And maybe the last point to make, that when I started or even ended thinking about this topic a couple of days ago, I've read an article in a very fashionable American journal saying that the very term collapse applied to the fall of the Soviet Union automatically implies that someone who does it supports either totalitarian or imperial paradigm in describing the Soviet Union. And I thought, like, okay, I hope it's not my case, but like then it's like, why? But why then, and how this collapse actually, I'm not joking yet. It's a serious article with a very, like this typical political correct and so on argument. And I was thinking, like, why still, despite what I said about the elites change and so on, why I would still probably would not be afraid of this term collapse? Because, even like thinking myself, like what happened to my family, or like people whom I know, even to me, it was still very much events that were kind of, if you wish, a kind of like collapse of the world that existed before. Because as I said, if you lost your money, you should switch into another language at school. It was my case, so from Russian to Ukrainian. You should think differently about the place where you live, so the closed city, because the Soviet rockets became opened. And once, I was going back home and have some of this old Czech Škoda with these Czechoslovak, numbers. It was like, a shock, because it was absolutely impossible even like 1 year before. No way, no foreigners, including socialist countries, could enter the city, and so on. And it is important to keep in mind all the complexity of these changes. But what's even more important here, in my view, is that history writing, also about the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the end of the Soviet Union, is still have a kind of a problem or interesting situation that quite often we pay much more attention to, like discussing some rigid terms or trying to prove our own ideological beliefs, writing about Gorbachev and whatever else, than to think seriously about the people whose stories we are telling. Real people who very much experienced those events. And for me, it's much more important not to, let's say, interpret this entire story briefly presented as a kind of a proof or disproof of the fact that socialism could be built in human society or not. But it's much more important to keep in mind all the time that people whom we're talking about, they were and they still are known as human, frightened, naive, alone, whatsoever, as we are. And that's what history writing is about. Thank you very much. yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Andrii, for your talk. We have plenty of time for questions. So please raise your hand, and our colleague with a microphone will come over and allow you to ask your questions.
Hello, my name is George. I would like to ask whether you think that the collapse of the Soviet Union was caused by mainly internal factors or also some external factors.
You know, the only reasonable answer would be both, of course. Would be both, because internally, again, we'll have all this stuff starting from nationality problems and the contradiction of Soviet national politics, and ending with the logic of Republican nomenclatura and economic issues. And externally, it was also, of course, very much the effect of, you know, Soviet economy dependency on, let's say, prices for oil and gas, and Afghanistan war, which caused a lot of also economic trouble for the country, and to speak about human losses there. So I do not believe in any, like, you know, like one or two factors explanation, because it was a process which has its own dynamics, which also related very much on the international context. And it was also, I would say, very much unpredictable for the persons involved. Because now, for instance, in the Gorbachev memoirs, there is like a conversation, he like, at least, let's say, pretending to remember, conversation about actually the future of Germany. And there he said something like that: I've tried to explain that the reunification of Germany could mean the end to perestroika. Oh, you may ask, like, but why? Yeah, like reunification of Germany and perestroika in the Soviet Union. But actually, that's a kind of this interaction or interplay, because it was also very much about legitimacy, yeah, like possibility to, you know, to control the situation that was going on, and so on. And it's also, I would say, amazing that when those 6 republics, for instance, they decided not to participate in the referendum, that also people from KGB or from the army located there, they somewhere decided to agree with the decision of the local Republican elites, and not to follow, let's say, Gorbachev logic, who was very much for the referendum in the entire territory. That is why it was a really kind of interplay all the time. And the real danger here is to think that we could easily explain, for instance, even like this, like American politics in this way. Because again, if you analyze American politics, American, let's say, thinking about the situation, we'll see that they were very much, a lot of people close to Bush, they were very much afraid of independent Ukraine and Belarus with their nuclear weapons. And actually, as we know also, it was a kind of like precondition, yeah, so for Ukraine to be finally accepted after it all happened, you know, internally, but you should get rid of the nuclear arms, should send them back to Russia, because it was a kind of like condition to do that. And this nuclear factor proved to be much more important than, you know, all other considerations involved here. And I think it's actually a very difficult task for us to keep this situational complexity all time in mind, and not to say that like it was already clear from the beginning or from that to that it would go like that. Yeah.
My name is Kathy Warner. I was wondering if you could say something about the degree of disaffection among Soviet peoples, and why that was so underestimated. In all the events you were talking about, and sort of the agreements and the votes, I mean, there's nobody that's at all agitating for the Soviet Union or for socialism. And why was it that in your view, that was so underestimated, certainly in the West, but I think even by the Soviet leadership and arguably even by Soviet people themselves?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a good question, of course, and it's almost impossible, no, let's say, to answer it properly, because yeah, because, you know, if you even ask nowadays about their reactions to that, it's not enough, because, okay, like people are tending, as always, to explain their behavior in the past according to some, you know, recent realities and situation. Because I've met also a lot of people who would say, we voted for Ukrainian independence because we imagined it very differently. But okay, it's, you know, it's almost always like that. You imagine it differently, then you have a result. So I would say that first of all, this dissolution of the state, I would dare to say that, seemed something completely, let's say, unrealistic for the majority of people, at least in some republics. Maybe not in Latvia and Estonia, but in case of Ukraine, it was, I would say, very much like that. So all those talks about sovereignty, they were always done more or less like that. Yes, we are sovereign, but you see, first of all, we'll have more or less the same leadership. So the same people whom we know, you know, from the Communist Party of Ukraine and so on. Of course, it was quite often mentioned in those declarations of sovereignty that people will still have Soviet citizenship. So it's like, I still have Soviet. It was more or less like that. I still have Soviet and I have something more. It was not thinking that I could lose more. It was really like this interesting idea. And of course, I think that actually this Donbass story is a good example here, that people were not at all prepared for the difficulties of the transformation period. Because, you know, this belief, I also like remember all those publications saying that we should just, like in this case, Ukraine. So Ukraine should just get rid of the rest of the Soviet Union and it would be, you know, rich like in Germany in like 2 months or 3 months. And it was seriously like proposed as a kind of economic program. Of course, it never happened, but people were tending to believe it. And I remember I found once a quote from like Russian politologists who said that paradoxically, or maybe not paradoxically, in late Soviet Union, a lot of people, they tended to believe in democracy, let's say, in their own way, but understanding democracy as a way to solve economic problems, as a way to become richer, as a way to, just like to get a better life, and not as an instrument to form the government which will then should be controlled and whatsoever. And of course, again, I think it's very important to remember that all those referendums or elections, they happened in the country where there were no referendums, or at least comparatively free elections before. And now you were asked, being like, you know, like, okay, now you should vote, or now you should change, you should understand this question. And of course, there was no kind of like program of deeper political education in this sense. So I think that it all played a kind of a role here. But I would still, let's say, argue that this terrible economic situation in late 80s, early 90s contributed a lot to this anti-Soviet, let's say, set of arguments or attitudes. Because if you see that your life is getting worse, like literally, everything like, okay, but maybe we should, like, who knows, maybe like getting rid of the Soviet Union will at least, you know, stop inflation and whatsoever. So it was a kind of like attempt to be logical in a very difficult situation. You know, like when you receive this humanitarian aid from the US, and it's like, oh my God, like it's like, you know, the only like butter whatsoever you could have there. And then it changed a lot. And you see, and if you think about this, let's say, Soviet nostalgia, which appeared later and which is very strong, as we know in many cases, this nostalgia was a kind of a reaction then to these, let's say, unrealistic beliefs of the late Soviet period, much more than like real, let's say, nostalgia for, you know, what we remember from, you know, Brezhnev years. So it's a kind of a, it was maybe even a paradox. But of course, typologically speaking, in this case, as well as in some recent cases, now also like referendums, in the European Union and so on, you have this idea that the argument for preserving something, like for keeping it, you know, like somewhere like reforming it, sounds much weaker than like easy arguments saying that we should get rid of it, we should just try someone else, and then we'll see, then we'll count later how much will it cost and so on. You know what happened with this Kuzbas miners? It's also interesting because Kuzbas, when post-Soviet Russia let's say, developed itself and privatized, almost all those mines were closed. So there is no real mining industry of Kuzbas nowadays. So people were fighting against Gorbachev, against Soviet Union, to have what? To have no job now. So it's a kind of interesting situation, of course. And I think that, yeah, we could understand it in that context. And I also agree. I would also say that it's very difficult to find bright examples of pro-Soviet Union mass movements or propaganda, or even like public figures in that time period. It was always like out of dated and irrelevant and naive and so on. And the same that in 2 months you live like in Germany, it was that's serious. That's that's a kind of understanding of the situation. So so that's the power of the moment, I would say, which was very short, of course.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really like your approach that you kind of postulating that history from below approach, but I was kind of missing that name of Alexei Yurchak and his famous book about everything was forever until it was no more, because he's practicing exactly this approach. And I was wondering, because you argued a little bit about that paradoxical mood during that time, and he's writing that the fall of the Soviet Union was totally unexpected, but at the same time everyone was prepared for it. And he talks a lot about this mood and atmosphere in the late 1980s, and I wanted to ask you as a witness of that time, if you could enlarge a little bit upon that, and maybe also have a short comment about his approach and his view on that late Soviet period. That would be interesting for me. Thank you.
I have a question about two factors which are often called like the reasons for the collapse of Soviet Union. They're quite different but nevertheless connected. The first reason is, the first factor is like human rights activists, Helsinki group, and all of them who created some izdat, and the works which were discussed in the kitchens and created such double moral, double thinking of the Soviet population. And the second reason is Chernobyl. You mentioned it for Belarus, but I think that it was really important for the whole population of Soviet Union. So I'd like you to estimate these two factors. Thank you.
Oh, very good. Thank you very much. So let's start from Yurchak story and then come back to that. So yeah, you're very much right. Of course, I agree. And actually, the title of Alexei's book is exactly what I've also heard many times from people from Dnipropetrovsk saying, talking about the 80s, saying that it was like this impression that this Brezhnev style life will last forever. And until now, people quite often they remember the prices for all the products because they were the same prices for 10 years. And you know that meal, that if it's like a butter or bread or whatever, it's always the same. And actually, it's also interesting that perestroika was very much about like the destruction of this certainty and knowledge and so on. And that is why, I would also say that it's like paradoxically, on the one hand, it was as if forever, but on the other hand, if you see already those changes and also price changes, you're suddenly thinking like, but okay, like it is going somewhere else. And that was a kind of a paradox, even though I still believe that any society, of course, it's understandable, is never like well prepared for such a change. When you said like, like forget about your money, in the bank, just start it, from zero. It's always difficult. Doesn't matter whether it's Soviet or Venezuela or, in Switzerland, somewhere else. Okay. Okay, in Switzerland, of course, you can't imagine it. That's the problem. But it's exactly actually what happened to a lot of people, of course, in the USSR, very much. So that's true. What is a kind of not a problem but important factor in Yurchak writings and some other writings? You see, they are usually focused on let's say capital cities. So like capital cities in Russia, so Moscow and Leningrad. That's okay, very much. And of course it was also very much the center of intellectual life, absolutely. And if you look at the biographies of people, it doesn't matter, historians, writers, alternative artists from the provinces, they've tried their best to go to Moscow. It was a typical story, or to Leningrad if possible. But still, I do believe that we need a kind of a more research like that done everywhere, you know, like in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan, in Moldova, because it's not no less important, and unfortunately it's still missing. So it's a kind of this, like, it's not a kind of a danger, but a situation when you have a lot of very good, well-presented narratives about, first of all, Moscow and Leningrad-based intellectuals, and much less about other regions, including, of course, Russia itself, like, you know, Saratov or Volgograd and whatsoever. So I hope it would, you know, go also like regionally, yeah, in this direction. And now about two factors. So, first of all, of course, you're right. This entire perestroika and glasnost opened possibilities and spaces for almost all activities that were most probably be called as like dissident or unacceptable like 2 or 3 years before. For instance, in 1987, there was the first meeting of the group which is now known as Memorial in Russia, so it is still relevant. It's also impressive. So it's still relevant since 1987, and many, many others. And Helsinki group, of course, no doubt, and all of them. The question here is, first of all, okay, yeah, let's say, how many people were involved and how to judge their influence. Because even Amalrik, you know, he started his book from this point, actually, asking like, whether it's reasonable to think or to take seriously this dissident movement in the Soviet Union. And he tried to explain which groups are there and so on. And for me, it's still a question like, how deep, yeah, the influence of such initiatives went. I know, for instance, there was an attempt, again, like coming back, for instance, to Ukraine, to make even a kind of like, you know, like a collective biography of everyone literally involved in movements like that. Helsinki group or Memorial or local ecological activists. And then you have this like list of people, at least like before early 90s, because early 90s is a huge, of course, yeah, change. And the list is very short, incredibly short. So we're talking about, let's say, around 1,000 persons, including someone who just signed something once, which is, yeah, not always so impressive. So in other words, it's really a kind of, how to put it? So on the one hand, not to completely forget about them, or like, you know, completely underestimate, but on the other hand, also not to overestimate such initiatives if compared to the decisions made by some groups inside nomenclatura. That's at least my impression, especially from Ukrainian case. Maybe in some other republics it was really different. And about Chernobyl, of course, you're right. It was not just Soviet story. It was also very much the story for Western Europe and the US and Japan and whatsoever. Of course, the own issues of, you know, like and nuclear atom energy, but also like issues of environment and stuff like that. You're right. I would also say that in the late 80s there was a kind of also, if you wish, like a fashion in political life in Soviet Union to talk about those issues. You could have a list of people who, let's say, developed their political careers as environmentalists in Ukraine as well. And then actually gradually in the 90s this narrative, you know, disappeared because it was replaced by other problems and issues here, which is maybe like a sad story, but still it happened. I think that this Chernobyl, for instance, you know, like again, like I've tried to figure it out, for instance, how it was perceived locally in Dnipropetrovsk, for instance. It is not far away, but it is still, no, it's not also very close. And it seemed that in cities like that, so in southern Ukraine, it was a kind of a big issue, but it never provoked, you know, a kind of like a panic or massive movements as in Kiev or in some cities in Belarus. So it was also like this idea like how to deal with this issue of, which is not actually clear, what does it mean, this Mirny atom, this peaceful atom. And so I actually think that there are some very beautiful pictures, movies nowadays done about it. And They're trying to reconstruct how this actually how the Soviet person faces this threat, which has no actual explanation. You have no know what to do. And maybe I should mention, like the last point here, that if you look carefully at how Gorbachev behaved during the Chernobyl story, that's a pretty problematic aspect, because he at first tried to, let's say, to manipulate it, to downplay the issue. And also there were people accused of responsibility in Chernobyl, who actually tried to, to do what was possible to do, like to minimize the costs and so on. And that is why you could also find, for instance, in the memoirs by Shushkevich, this Belarusian politician, who also signed Belarusian agreement. I was actually surprised when he wrote like that for me, like the end of Gorbachev as a reliable politician was this Chernobyl story. Because he was in Minsk, he was close to the Academy of Sciences in Belarus, he knew more or less what's going on, and when he compared it to the narrative officially presented by Gorbachev on TV, he was shocked, oh, that's the leader who is supposed, to lead us and who is just lying about it. So in this sense, you see this Chernobyl was also kind of a delegitimizing factor, we put it this way, for Gorbachev and the entire Politburo. It was one more step in delegitimizing them in the eyes of a lot of people, at least who was capable of understanding what happened.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I wanted to ask you to elucidate a little bit more on the reasons why, for instance, the autonomous republics within contemporary Russia were not allowed to have the same entitlement to independence as the other Soviet republics.
Okay. No. So the obvious answer would be that potential, let's imagine it, potential independence of Chechnya or any other republic will just automatically mean the potential, again, destruction or dissolution of the entire Russian Federation. And you see that, again, according to this logic, Soviet logic and post-Soviet logic, only Soviet republics were allowed to decide whether they stay or whether they go out. And of course, again, if you could speculate, who knows, we could imagine a situation that the result of the war in Chechnya would be different, and then maybe it will open some possibilities. Because as we also know, there are some both, let's say, nationalists and liberals in present-day Russia who say that Russia should get rid of Chechnya in order to be like better place. And in one case it would be like better, like a national Russian state and not having all those privileged Chechens. On the other hand, it would be like saying that if we get rid of this territory, it could help actually to like rethink Russia in modern terms of like European nation state and so on. But Yeltsin decided to do something else. You see, he decided immediately to proclaim the state of emergency and to react militarily. So apparently, he was very much afraid that it was, first of all, it would cause more attempts to become independent inside Russia. And secondly, apparently, it was also like this fears that it could make future, let's say, Russia politics on the post-Soviet space much more problematic. Because again, let us not forget that in the autumn 1991, so President of Russia Yeltsin and like people around him, they proposed, they were actually very much for the kind of a solution to have maybe smaller but still a Soviet, like here, каким же он будет новый союз? To have something like the Soviet Union. Okay, without, in this case, you see even like Georgia, Moldova, maybe not, but the rest we could keep. And they even tried to negotiate with Gorbachev to find this kind of a confederative solution and so on. And actually Gorbachev said no. It's gone, you lost the chance, it's Putin and so on. And of course, if you're thinking about like this, like attempt somewhere to reintegrate the territory, then problems with your own republics, seems to be very serious. And again, if we look at the map at that moment, we'll see that the borders of the Soviet republics, they were supposed to remain stable, even though, of course, we have Transnistria, we have Nagorno-Karabakh, this Armenian-Azerbaijan issue, and so on. Crimea come much, much later, but it's also like in the same direction, questioning the borders which are not the Republican borders. But in this case, Yeltsin, I would say, as a politician, he proved to be a supporter of Russian state, which will not lose its territories, even if they, you know, for some reasons want to do it. Of course, we know his quote saying that you could take as much sovereignty as you want, but it was a kind of like nice talk. But when it comes to real situation, the real idea that, okay, so we'll try to do that, the reaction was very different. And that was, in this case, already a reaction of a kind of a post-Soviet state that tries to protect its borders. And maybe even, I'm thinking now, could it be compared, not at least partly, also to the logic of present-day Ukrainian politics? In other words, like to keep the borders of the country, not necessarily because, you know, like we love Crimea so much or we love Donetsk so much, but just to like to keep this legality, to keep this legitimacy of the borders recognized by many international agreements. And yeah, that's of course the question about the cost of such an attitude. But I think that for him and for other Russian politicians, it was more or less like that. And exactly for Khodorkovsky also, you remember this famous quote when he said that I will fight for Chechnya as well, because it's part of Russian soil. It's exactly this logic, because if you couldn't like start this process, and then who knows, then in the end there will be like yeah, something very different, as in Sorokin novels. So to make this realization of Sorokin dreams more difficult, more complicated, they decided to keep the borders, even though there are a lot of questions how those borders were drawn in Stalin years, of course. And that's a different, I would say this is one of the fundamental problems of Russia, again, that it's a federation where there are some entities that are defined ethnically and territorially, so like territorial ethnicity, like Chechnya again, or Ingushetia, and there are some other entities that are just administrative or economic units. And now it's a kind of an interesting situation, because it's not like we have just republics on the national, sometimes it's just like Stavropolsky Krai and whatsoever, but they need to function in one state according to like one regulation. So I do think that it will remain a real problem, you know, for years. Not just for Chechnya and such problematic borderlands, but for the entire structure of the state. And this entire structure is very much, of course, the product of the Soviet nationality politics. So it's a kind of ongoing story. It's not, yeah, it's not an end stage. It's just the continuation of some complicated processes.